Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm speaking from Canada, so it's nice to be able to join everyone. My paper is called International Forced Labor from a Gendered Perspective. So, historically, when considering events such as Western colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, discrimination based on identity and gender is not a new phenomenon. And when we look at the statistics of forced labor, women and girls are disproportionately victimized. So females make up to 71% of modern slaves, 99% of forced sexual exploitation, and 84% of victims of forced marriage. So clearly, this is a systemic and structural problem inherent in our society, our legislation, and economic systems, and it targets females and makes them adversely incorporated into the market activities based on these vulnerabilities. So they often have to prioritize short-term gains, making them vulnerable to exploitative practices, and therefore this perpetuates a poverty trap. The paper that I present today considers the definitions of forced labor, specifically those presented by the International. Couple of limitations that I discussed. The first is that the definition proposed by the ILO fails to recognize the different nuances and degrees of forced labor. So in an empirical investigation of the cocoa and tea supply chains, individuals often were shown to move between both forced and severely exploitative labor throughout their lives, so it makes it very difficult to track. And moreover, there's a misconception that forced labor occurs after a significant event, such as a manipulation, deceit, or kidnapping, when in reality it is as simple as a contract or an exchange of money. And the second limitation with the ILO definition of forced labor is that it does not recognize economic coercion. In other words, if the person has agency to leave their job, this is not forced labor. But when that person's options are either poor working conditions and low wages versus starvation and destitution, the option is often illusory. So the ILO only recognizes physical or psychological coercion conducted by a specific agency or a specific individual. Another key definition that I explain is the often more popular term that's been used in legislation, such as in the UK, which is called modern slavery. This is often an umbrella term to encompass a variety of different aspects of forced labor, sexual exploitation, and human trafficking. However, I often choose to avoid using this term within this paper, primarily because of A, its ambiguity, B, its potential to shame countries by providing some sort of imperialistic perspective, especially countries that have higher forced labor rates, and then C, because of the emotion that is often attached with the word slavery. And taking all of this into account, the question that my paper tries to answer is that why does forced labor amongst women and girls continue to persist despite the fact that there are numerous national labor laws, international commitments such as the ILO Forced Labor Convention number 29, and national legislation, as well as corporate social responsibility programs that occur privately. So in order to answer this question and to discover why forced labor still persists, I provide two different perspectives. The first is considering from a supply and demand side theory. So basically, this reveals motivations that from both economic, political, and legal lenses, there are motivations towards keeping forced labor persistent in society. From a supply side, this would mean what factors supply a workforce that's more vulnerable to exploitation, so leading to adverse incorporation, limited labor protection offered by state legislation. There's often restrictive mobility regimes such as tied visas, which prevents migrants who enter countries to find employment and prevents them from leaving those situations. And then from a demand side, which is basically answering the question, why is there a demand for multinational corporations to use these type of labor techniques? And this is often due to gaps in governance, governments often allow companies to regulate these situations at their own terms. There is irresponsible sourcing practices, concentrated corporate power. And when you look at the numbers, you will see that forced labor is actually a $150.2 billion profit-making business. And the greatest profits are found in Asia Pacific region because of that large number of victims in Asia. And this type of analysis really validates that forced labor is not a consequence of unethical or greedy individuals, but it's a structural phenomenon. The second aspect that I tackle within this paper is looking at the case study from Pakistan. So I take a look at two specific cases. The first case is Darshan Masih versus State, and this is one of the first landmark cases that addressed bonded labor, and it really solidifies the role of judicial activism in the realm of public interest litigation. In this case, the Supreme Court invoked suo motu powers based on a telegram sent by a group of brick kiln bonded laborers fearing for their security. And they were able to dispense of traditional locus standing and allow the Supreme Court to take a more liberal interpretation, and directed the government to declare bonded labor as unconstitutional and urging them to outline legislation, which leads to the 1992 Bonded Labor System Abolition Act, which directly addresses the issue at hand. And then finally, the other case my paper takes a look at is the judgment of High Court of Sindh from the Circuit Court, Hyderabad, 2002. And this case is significant in demonstrating that despite the fact that there is legislation to tackle this issue, it hasn't been adequately applied in the current context. For instance, in this case, it was significant in not using the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act to help the bonded laborers who had made the plea. And instead, it demonstrated that in order for a person to be a bonded laborer, there must be some sort of physical detention.
We are running late on time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.